137 meters long, 23 meters wide, 3 complete stories stacked on top of each other. God didn't give Noah vague instructions or leave anything up to interpretation. The measurements came directly from above, precise and undeniable. Build yourself an ark. 4 simple words that kicked off one of the most massive construction projects a single man would ever attempt. The Bible tells us the dimensions. It tells us what materials to use. It tells us why the ark had to exist in the first place. But here's what it doesn't tell us: the actual work. The backbreaking, seemingly impossible process of turning divine blueprints into physical reality. Noah wasn't just given a task, he was given a mountain to climb, and every step of that climb came with obstacles the ancient text never bothered to spell out. But any builder from that era would have known exactly what Noah was up against. Let's start with something most people completely overlook: the ground beneath the ark. You can't just build something 137 meters long anywhere you feel like it. Noah needed space, solid, stable space, nowhere near steep slopes or unstable ground, and it had to be close to the cypress forests because that's where all his building material would come from. Picture Noah walking across the land, testing the soil with his feet, pressing his hand into the earth to feel how firm it was, studying the trees nearby, checking if he could actually get materials from the forest to the building site. No bulldozers, no geological surveys, no engineering team. Just his own judgment, his experience, and his faith in what God told him to do. Once he found the right spot, the real work started. And trust me, it wasn't pretty. Hauling away massive stones, ripping out roots that had been growing deep into the ground for decades, leveling every single meter of land, packing down the soil so it could hold the weight of tons and tons of wood. All of this with basic hand tools. But Noah had something more powerful than equipment. He had purpose. Now here's where it gets interesting. The world before the flood wasn't like ours. The Bible mentions that a mist used to rise up from the earth and water the whole ground. That's Genesis chapter 2 verse 6, which means the soil was constantly damp. And damp soil is a nightmare for construction. It turns to mud, your tools get stuck. Wood soaks up moisture and starts to rot. The foundation becomes weak. So Noah probably had to dig trenches around the entire work site. Simple drainage channels to redirect all that groundwater away from where he was building. He wasn't dealing with rain from above. The earth itself was pushing moisture up from below. And while he was doing all of this, people walked by, staring, some of them laughing, others muttering to each other. Why is this guy preparing such a massive piece of land for nothing? But Noah didn't waste time explaining himself. He wasn't building for their approval. He was building because God told him to. Finally, after all that grueling preparation, the ground was ready, firm, level, and dry enough to support what came next, which brought Noah face to face with his next massive problem: getting the wood. The Bible specifically says to use cypress wood, and cypress trees aren't little saplings you can chop down in an afternoon. These were enormous, thick, heavy trees, perfect for a structure this size, but incredibly difficult to work with. Cutting down just one tree with primitive tools took serious strength and endless patience. Cutting down hundreds of them, that was a test of pure endurance. One strike at a time, one tree at a time, Noah and his sons kept at it until finally the sound of another massive trunk crashing to the forest floor echoed through the trees. But here's the thing. Cutting the tree down was only the beginning. Now they had to move it. A giant cypress trunk weighs an unbelievable amount. And Noah didn't have wheels. He didn't have enough animals to drag them. He definitely didn't have machinery. The solution? The same one ancient peoples had been using for generations. Wooden rollers. They'd take smaller logs and lay them on the ground like a track. Then they'd position the massive cypress trunk on top and use ropes and levers to pull it forward, inch by inch. A few meters at a time. Every time the log rolled past the back roller, they'd pick it up and move it to the front, then pull again. It was slow, exhausting, dangerous. But every single log they managed to transport was one more piece of what God had told them to build. Noah kept going because when you've received direct instructions from God, you don't work based on what you see around you. You work based on what you believe. Meanwhile, people in the area were watching all of this unfold, men hauling enormous tree trunks toward this giant cleared piece of land. Of course they mocked him. Of course they doubted. But none of that mattered to Noah. He wasn't working for their approval. He was working because God told him to. As the wood piled up on the construction site, Noah faced the most complicated part of the entire project. It wasn't just about cutting trees and dragging them anymore. Now he had to build something that could survive the most catastrophic storm in human history. For the ark to stay together, to remain straight and strong through whatever was coming, Noah had to start with the foundation, the backbone of the entire vessel, the keel. The Bible doesn't walk us through the construction process step by step, but anyone who knew anything about building back then would have understood what Noah was up against. A structure this massive needed a central beam, one incredibly long, incredibly strong piece running the entire length of the ship. It had to support the hull, the 3 decks, and all the weight of everything that would be loaded inside. But here's the problem. No tree on Earth grows to 137 meters, not even close, which meant Noah had to join multiple giant beams together, end to end, creating one continuous, perfectly straight, rock-solid line. That kind of work required serious skill, precision, and a level of patience most people don't have. The beams had to be cut and fitted using wooden joints. This was a technique ancient civilizations had been using for a long time. Mortise and tenon joints. One piece carved with a protruding section, the other carved with a matching slot. When done right, they lock together as solidly as if they were one piece. And to make absolutely sure those joints held, Noah would have driven in wooden pegs made from the hardest wood available, creating connection points strong enough to hold the entire structure together even when the storm tried to rip it apart. Once the keel was in place, Noah reached one of those moments that must have been both thrilling and terrifying. He had to raise the ribs of the ark. These were the curved beams that would rise up from the sides and give the hull its shape, and they had to fit perfectly, no room for error. So Noah and his sons did what skilled builders had been doing for generations. They carved custom joints by hand, each one designed to let the beams tilt and curve naturally as they locked into the keel. And as those ribs started rising up along the length of the ship, for the first time, the actual shape of the ark began to take form. Picture this for a second. Massive, heavy wooden beams being hoisted into the air using nothing but levers, thick ropes, and raw human strength. Noah and his sons pulling, adjusting, checking angles, watching every single inch. Because if even one rib tilted too far in the wrong direction, the whole structure could lose its integrity. They probably stretched ropes from one end to the other as guidelines, used stones tied to strings as plumb bobs to make sure everything was perfectly vertical. And then they did it again, and again, dozens of times. As the skeleton of the ark came together, the sight must have been absolutely stunning. A massive wooden structure rising up out of the ground in a place where there had never been an ocean, the size of a modern building, but built entirely with hand tools and human effort. Then came one of the most critical steps, sealing the ark. Because it didn't matter how impressive the structure looked if water could get inside, and God was very specific about this part. Cover it inside and out with pitch. That detail matters more than you might think. Pitch is basically a resin that comes from the earth. It had to be heated until it was boiling, thickened down, and then applied while it was still hot. Once it cooled, it formed a hard, waterproof coating. But just covering the outside wouldn't cut it. Wood absorbs moisture over time. Any water seeping in from the inside could rot the whole thing from within. So Noah and his sons spent days, maybe even weeks, coating every crack, every joint, every tiny gap, inside and out. Each layer had to dry completely before they could add another one. A single missed spot could sink the entire project. Literally. When the final section was sealed and hardened, the ark wasn't just a wooden structure anymore. It was a completely sealed, waterproof shelter built to survive something that had never happened before in all of human history. But the work wasn't done. The next phase was just as crucial as building the hull, organizing the interior to actually house living creatures. The Bible gives us a key detail here. Make rooms in the ark. The Hebrew word used is kinim. It literally means nests or cells, small divisions. In other words, the ark wasn't just one giant open space. It was divided into smaller sections, carefully planned to maintain order, keep everyone safe, and keep the ship stable during the flood. Here's the thing. The Bible tells us there were 3 floors and compartments, but it doesn't give us a floor plan. So based on what we know, we can figure out what would have made the most sense, what would have been practical, what would have actually worked. To keep the vessel balanced, the smartest move would have been organizing the animals by weight and size. Bottom floor, the heavy animals, elephants, hippos, large cattle. Keeping all that weight low would prevent the ark from rocking dangerously side to side. Middle floor, medium-sized animals, lions, bears, deer, larger domestic animals. Top floor, birds and smaller, lighter creatures. Less impact on the balance and closer to the ventilation. This kind of division doesn't contradict anything in the Bible. In fact, it makes perfect sense for a structure this large. The compartments weren't just convenient, they were absolutely necessary. Without them, predators would go after prey, animals would hurt each other, it would be complete chaos inside. Disease would spread like wildfire. So Noah most likely built internal walls, simple but strong enough to keep each species separated in its own space. These walls had to fit together properly without weakening the hull. And remember, every single piece of wood he added meant more weight. Everything had to be calculated. Then there's ventilation. The Bible mentions this. Make a roof for it, leaving below the roof an opening 1 cubit high all around. That sounds like a long, continuous window running along the top of the ark, just under the roof. But to get air flowing through 3 entire floors, Noah probably created small protected openings on the sides. External overhangs to keep water out, internal corridors to let air circulate, all of it designed to work in the conditions of the pre-flood world. Because without proper ventilation, the gases from all those animals would have been lethal. And then there's food storage. A year's worth of food for every creature on board. Think about how much that is. The Bible says, take with you every kind of food that is to be eaten and store it away as food for you and for them. Hay, grains, dried fruits, roots, water stored in jars and containers. Entire sections of the ark had to be dedicated just to food, organized carefully, protected from moisture. The ark wasn't just a ship. It was a floating city with complete logistics. Even waste disposal had to be thought through. Slightly sloped floors maybe, simple drainage channels, small openings on the sides just to let liquids drain out. When every space, every division, every corridor was finally ready, Noah arrived at the most critical point of the entire construction. The door, a massive opening, big enough to let animals of every size walk through, but also strong enough not to weaken the entire structure. The door would be the most vulnerable part of the ark, and also the most symbolic, because the Bible says something extraordinary about it. The Lord closed the door. Man built it, but God sealed it. Out of everything on the ark, nothing drew more attention than that door. The Bible clearly states, make a door in the side of the ark. Genesis chapter 6, verse 16. To keep that massive opening from weakening the entire structure, Noah likely reinforced it with thick beams around the frame. Diagonal bracing, strong, deep joints, the hardest wood he could find on the edges, all of it to make sure the door wouldn't become the point where everything fell apart. And remember, Noah didn't have enough metal to create giant hinges like we use today, so the most logical system would have been a vertical pivot, a large reinforced wooden shaft on one side of the door, letting it swing open and closed, heavy but stable. Here's where it gets theologically significant. The Bible says, and the Lord shut him in. Genesis chapter 7 verse 16. Noah built it. God sealed it. Before the animals arrived, Noah must have walked through the entire interior of the ark one final time, testing the beams, checking to make sure the pitch had hardened completely, looking for any cracks, reinforcing the ribs, assessing the weight of all the provisions already loaded on board, listening to the sounds the wood made. In large wooden structures, the wood talks, it creaks, it settles, it adapts. And Noah, after years of working with this vessel, would have known immediately if something was wrong. And then something supernatural happened. The Bible is very clear about this. The animals came to Noah, they weren't captured, they weren't herded or driven, they didn't wander in by accident, they came. It was like watching a perfectly coordinated movement, as if an invisible hand was guiding each species exactly where it needed to go. Picture the scene. Pairs of animals emerging from the forest, birds landing near the entrance, wild creatures walking calmly right alongside animals they would normally hunt, reptiles crawling in the exact direction they needed to go, young animals following instincts they had never been taught. and each one positioning itself in perfect order. No chaos, no confusion, no attacks. It was undeniable proof that this wasn't just a human construction project. This was a divine act unfolding right before the eyes of Noah's family. When everyone was inside, the animals, the birds, the reptiles, Noah, his wife, his 3 sons and their wives, 8 people in total, the work was complete. Faith had been obeyed. And now the most challenging part began. Surviving inside the ark during the flood. With the door closed by God's own hand, a different kind of silence filled the ark. Outside, the world went on like nothing was about to happen. Inside, everything was ready. Animals in their compartments, food stored, the structure sealed and solid. It was the beginning of something humanity had never experienced before. The Bible describes this moment with heavy words. In the 600th year of Noah's life, on the 17th day of the 2nd month, on that day all the fountains of the great deep burst forth, and the windows of the heavens were opened. Genesis chapter 7, verse 11. That means underground water exploding to the surface, internal pressure being released from deep within the earth, massive volumes of water shooting upward with violent force, earthquakes, deep fractures ripping through the ground. Noah's family must have felt the ark shake, not from water above, but from the violent movement of the earth beneath them. Then something even more extraordinary happened. The windows of heaven opened. It was the first rain in human history. And it wasn't a light drizzle, thick, heavy drops, the volume increasing rapidly, a deafening roar pounding against the wood. Thunder crashed. Lightning tore across the sky. The ark, which had been sitting still on dry ground, began to feel the first waters accumulating around it. Think about the neighbors who had laughed at Noah, the people who called the ark insanity. The Bible doesn't describe what they felt, but it's not hard to imagine, screaming at the strange rain falling from the sky. Shock as the water kept rising, people running in every direction, not understanding what was happening, panic over something they had never seen before. The faith that had seemed like madness was now the only thing that could save them. The water rose and rose and rose, until finally the massive solid hull began to float. For Noah and his family, that moment must have been impossible to put into words. The wood groaning under the strain, the floor vibrating beneath their feet, the first gentle rocking motion, the sound of water slapping against the side of the vessel, the ark lifting off the ground for the first time. This ship, built over the course of decades, was finally doing exactly what it was made to do. The ark didn't have sails, no oars, no rudder. It didn't need them. It was in God's hands. The Bible describes it like this: the waters prevailed and increased greatly upon the earth. Genesis chapter 7, verse 19. Mountains vanishing beneath the surface, cities swallowed whole, trees ripped out of the ground, ancient life being erased right before the eyes of Noah's family. Inside the ark, it was like its own world. Outside, everything was dying. Inside, God was preserving life. The contrast couldn't have been more absolute. How long did the rain last? The sound of it pounding on the roof stopped after 40 days. But the flood was far from over. The Bible tells us the waters prevailed upon the earth 150 days. Genesis chapter 7, verse 24. Even without rain, the water kept rising and moving, covering mountains, plains, valleys, everything that had existed before. Inside the ark, time felt frozen. But there was work every single day, feeding the animals, cleaning the compartments, checking the beams, reinforcing joints, monitoring stability, praying, waiting. And then, after long months of waiting, the biblical narrative reveals a turning point. God remembered Noah. Genesis chapter 8, verse 1. The Bible says God sent a wind over the earth and the waters began to go down, slowly. Day after day, the level started dropping until the ark came to rest on the mountains of Ararat. Genesis chapter 8, verse 4. After months of living in partial darkness, Noah opened the upper window. For the first time since the flood started, fresh air rushed in. Natural light filled the interior of the ark, but he still had no way of knowing if the earth was ready. So he made a logical, wise decision. He released a raven. Then he released a dove. The dove came back because it couldn't find anywhere to land. The world was still underwater. A week later, Noah tried again. The dove returned, but this time it was carrying an olive leaf. The first sign of a new beginning. Another week passed. Noah released the dove for the third time, and it didn't come back. The earth was finally becoming habitable again. After more than a year inside the ark, God spoke again. "Go out from the ark, you and your wife and your sons wives with you." Genesis chapter 8, verse 16. And Noah obeyed. The door, the very door that God had shut, was now open. Intense light flooded the interior. The animals began to emerge, species by species, following their instincts, spreading out across the new land. The entire family stepped onto solid ground for the first time in many months. The smell of wet earth, the pure air, the profound silence. Everything was new. Nothing from the old world had survived. But God's grace had preserved enough life for a fresh start. As soon as he left the ark, Noah did something symbolic, powerful, memorable. He built an altar to the Lord. There, among rocks and dried mud and the beginning of a restored landscape, Noah offered a sacrifice. The Bible says God was pleased with the aroma and made a promise. "Never again will I destroy all living creatures." And then he placed a visible sign in the sky, the rainbow, an eternal covenant, reminding humanity that even in judgment, God preserves a remnant, sustains life, and opens a path for those who have faith. With the flood over, the ark had fulfilled its purpose. Now a new chapter began. Noah and his family would repopulate the earth. Nations would arise from Noah's sons. The world would have new cycles, seasons, boundaries established by God. The story of redemption would continue. From that vessel, all of post-flood humanity would be born. And the ark, a symbol of obedience, faith, and salvation, remained as proof that God always rescues those who trust in his voice. If you've made it this far, you already understand. The ark wasn't just a boat, it was an act of faith carved into wood. It was salvation preserved on 3 levels. It was God's answer to sin, and at the same time, proof of his love for life. But Noah's story doesn't end with the ark. There's so much more about the restart of humanity, the new covenant, the generations that came after, and how all of this connects to God's greater plan. Click the video on the side to discover what happened after the flood